So Willis O'Brien actually took on students as well, and one student who actually sought after him and was finally mentored by him was a young man named Ray Harryhausen. When Ray Harryhausen started his tutelage under Willis O'Brien, he was but the learner. When he left, he was the master. More on Ray Harryhausen in a little bit, one of the legends of stop motion animation. Let's talk a little bit about the good and the bad of stop motion. The good, traditionally, is that once the shot is done, theoretically, it's in the can. Lighting is done, camera work is done, performance tweaks are minimal, and post-production tasks are usually pretty small in scope because of the performance is actually captured right there in camera. Now, this is a good for most stop motion workflows and pipelines. When we talk a little bit about Leica going on in the future, the stop motion animation is actually just one small part of the overall process. And they do not hide the fact that they are on a very hybrid approach of stop motion plus visual effects. As you can see on some of these shots, like here's the making of Kubo, and certainly not the case here because obviously they have to replace the background green screen. But as we've seen recently in the breakdown for Kubo and the two strings, animating the performance is really just the beginning for that specific studio. But what's interesting about all this VFX in stop motion is the fact that, they readily admit this is not the quintessential art form. It's more of a hybrid approach and something that they've mentioned more than once. The bad. Nobody really knows what the end of the animated shot really looks like, or if it was working or timed correctly until the film was properly developed and saw the next day or even the next week. This was the historical kind of approach to stop motion. You really didn't know if what you were working on was working until you developed that film, which would take quite a bit of time, and then actually saw it, and then if it turned out terrible, you'd have to redo the whole thing. Now, not so much the case with the advent of more technological help in stop motion, specifically great tools and software like Dragon Frame, which allows you to literally stop in the middle of what you're doing, rewind, and quickly play back the performance. And then you could quickly stop, you could tweak, you can go back, or you could change. So that's a huge advantage to the stop motion process. But that digital process, was never the case previously. So it can be pretty tense. Thanks to, of course, the innovation of digital cameras, animators obviously play back and view their progress constantly now with much, much more freedom than before. Huge advantage over modern stop motion classics. The freedom was exploited heavily in the very first stop motion movie filmed solely with digital SLR cameras. And that was, of course, Tim Burton's Corpse Bride back in 1995. This also allowed them to begin editing footage a mere hours later. The whole film was shot with the Canon EOS 1D. So you could see basically why animators absolutely love this new process. So how long does actually all this take? Well, many factors affect production time. The complexity of the shot, naturally, the number of characters, accessibility of the puppet, how easy is the puppet to work with, and of course the style and speed of the animator. But there is an average for feature film for doing stop motion. A typical animator on The Nightmare Before Christmas, which came out in 93, Corpse Bride, 2005, or Coraline in 2009, was about 2 to 3 seconds of animation a day. Let me repeat that, because that's pretty important. The average animator completed 2 to 3 seconds of animation per day. And consider it's a 90-minute movie, process takes some time. Episodic TV character work for stop motion can average a little bit more, 7 to 10 seconds per day, even with the additional frame rate. But a typical full studio working at full capacity can kick out a full minute about in a week. So about a minute a week. So a 90-minute film, 90 weeks to complete, not a super fast art form. What's going on beneath the hood here, though? Most important element in production quality, stop motion, character is, of course, the armature. The armature is the skeleton of the character, the posable bones of the puppet. These armatures serve the same purpose as rigging in CG animation. The armature is a precise framework of steel joints machined to hold up and fit inside the puppet and maintain any stance imposed upon it. Some of these armatures we have already seen in the 1933 King Kong piece, but scrolling through some more armatures with their fully crafted counterparts, it's important to note that though they all share the same machining techniques and fasteners and joints and mechanics, it's really very rare to share actual armatures between characters. And usually they must be custom made for each character's size and proportions. Because, of course, if the characters are all different sizes and proportions, then the armatures have to be different sizes and proportions. So there's not a whole lot of reusability between characters with this stuff. External rigging is often used as well, called flying rigs or helper rigs. They don't actually make the character fly. This is a box troll, and he's on a unicycle, and obviously it's going to be really difficult to balance him on that unicycle, especially for an animation performance. So these little helper rigs would help with stability, hold them up, and of course, in post-production, you're going to have to rotoscope those things right out. But it's used for stability, and it would be removed with rig removal tools or rotoscope in post. The process. A largely collaborative effort like any feature film. The stop motion animator does not make the puppet. Now, I'll show you kind of behind the scenes here about how this is actually made. And earlier in the lecture, I mentioned that it's not a collaborative effort. It's not a collaborative effort in the terms where one animator has the performance in their head and they are creating that performance on that one puppet or stop motion character. That collaborative effort comes into play for all the other pieces putting it together to make the movie. Of course, the making of the movie is a collaborative effort, but the one solo artistic animation is usually the result of the animation in somebody's head or sketch. But the stop motion animator does not just make the puppet themselves. A concept artist, of course, creates the design, right? So everybody knows exactly what the character is going to look like, or the environments, or the wardrobe. Next, of course, a machinist makes the armature. Now, the armature, just to take a step back, like I said, is basically the same process they've been using all the way back in King Kong. They pretty much invented it. It was great. It was perfect. And if it's not broken, don't fix it. A sculptor forms oil-based clay over the armature, and a mold maker casts it in foam latex. If you remember back to the previous discussions about Stan Winston and all the creatures that they were creating, it's kind of like the same process right here. Mold makers casting it in foam latex. That way you can have a mold and you can make multiple copies because things always break. A painter paints the puppet up, and a costumer clothes it with, of course, many backup duplicates because, wear and tear, melting, who knows what's going to occur. You always need backups for things. A fabricator will come in and add hair and scales, etc. That's the traditional methodology of creating a stop motion puppet. Now, Leica, on the other hand, has some advanced methods at their disposal. And what they do is they actually create many, many, many faces or pieces of faces to get the performance, and that's actually 3D printed. And as not only the sculpt done by the 3D printer, but their 3D printers are so advanced now that it actually paints the actual model itself for consistency and speed. So the painter role is being reduced in scope as well. Leica's head of rapid prototyping, which is what they call it, Brian McLean, he says the faces were coming out in white plastic and they had a whole army of painters come in and hand paint every individual face. It was very laborious. It was very time consuming. Take a look at all these faces here for one character in a movie. So it can get pretty busy when it comes to where you're even going to store and catalog and organize all these things. So the solution they had to doing all this, of bringing in these armies of painters, was on Coraline, the studio's following film Paranorman as well, the Leica teamed with 3D Systems, which offered a brand new technology, and they call it 3D color powder printing. And the new printers created colorized faces that looked even more realistic and required no painting. That allowed Leica to ramp up the vitality of its puppets with each new film. So while Coraline actually used 207,000 expressions, Paranorman and the Box Trolls used 1.4 million and 1.5 million expressions, respectively. That's a lot. But that's nothing compared to Kubo and the Two Strings. That number stretched to an astonishing 48 million pieces. I don't even know where you'd store 48 million pieces. Let's take a look at behind the scenes with Leica Studio Master of Puppets.
You know, the puppet department is like a family. It takes around about 30 people to make one puppet. We're a special breed, and we're like a little sort of roving band of gypsies that travel around the world. You know, there's not many of us. We live, sleep, eat and breathe puppets and puppet making. I didn't even know what stop motion animation was when I was a kid. I just knew that I was hopeless at school, at academia. The doodles in my textbooks were way better than what I was supposed to be getting for math and English. So I went to art school, and then at the same time I started to collect old Victorian scary dolls. Then I realised that all of the kids' TV I'd grown up with in England was all stop motion. It all sort of made sense to me then. And you know, making a puppet is very much like making a doll, but it's a doll that you can then bring to life, so it's perfect. I started off as a generalist, so I did a bit of everything. You have to save the day when a puppet's head falls off, or suddenly you're resculpting something, you're painting it, you're doing everything. Over the years you grow with it, you learn all the mistakes and you try and act on those mistakes. And I got a phone call and it was Leica, and we need somebody who's a good puppet maker to come and set up the puppet department for Coraline. And I went, okay, I'll do it. There are 65 artists and craftspeople that work in my department. We have a sculpt department. The sculpts generally then go to the mold making department. And you don't just mold a whole body, you have to separate it into many different molds, so that if a hand breaks, you've got a separate hand. And if they have a change of footwear, you have to have a separate foot mold. The mold makers then hand their finished molds to the armature department. The armature builders are the people that build the skeletons. They will then hand their armatures and molds to the casting department. And then you have to decide how you're going to animate the face. At Leica, we've perfected replacement animation. Each mouth shape is a new face that goes on, and with each frame of film. And then we have all of sort of the look of the puppets. So the paint, the hair, and the costume. Hopefully your end puppet will be a fully animatable, posable puppet with a costume, with a completely painted sort of face, hair, costume, hands, and with a lovely wig. And then I'm the central person who sort of is in the middle of all of these people, making sure everybody is remembering to communicate and everybody knows when they're getting the mold and when the mold is going to the next department. If you forget to tell them one little thing, they could build something and have wasted months. Generally, I'm doing the upfront part of the process. So all the initial problem solving, setting up the teams, setting up the process, everything that I'm doing in a blue, that will be eventually molded in silicone and cast as a hard part. And then everything that I highlight in yellow will be a separate sculpt which will then sit over the joints, and that will be a soft part. I also work very closely with the director and the head of animation to make sure their vision is realized in the performance that the puppets can give, and then to remind my team that they have to communicate with each other.
Took about a week. The dupes we can run in 3 days or less.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm just getting ready to cast up these grandfather hands.
We're on track with
We're on
those.
track.
Oh, yeah.
We will be able to get a little additional movement.
Yeah, I think that would be good, and I
Okay.
think that's what the animator is hoping to get.
Yeah.
Most artists they're the sort of the quiet, determined types that go into their own little creative bubbles and they just do their thing. Constantly have to remind artists, no, you need to talk to the person next to you. It'll take from 3 to 6 months to make the first one off of a puppet. So that's all the problem solving, getting everything sort of set up for mass production. When you're doing a schedule for a movie, it's usually called a one-line schedule because everything's very linear. You know, with a puppet, it starts off as one line because it starts off as a sculpt, and then it explodes into about 500 lines, and then it comes back into a final puppet. It's interesting with puppets because they actually have to do more than a real sort of life person. So everything's exaggerated. It's cartoon. So, you know, you have to make the arms, the legs just do a little bit, we call it overextension. To do that, we're always having to think about initially what the skeleton can do, but then how the material over the top of the skeleton might hinder the movement. It's always a challenge of making them look gorgeous and get all of the performance. And I always say, we never finish a puppet until the last day of filming because we are constantly changing it per shot. You think, oh, we've made everything there is to make at this point. You know, there's no problems left to be solved. But of course, every single story brings a new challenge and a new problem. And each time we start one, we're like, oh, how are we going to make that? And suddenly, it feels like you've just blinked and it's done. And these characters have achieved everything the animators have wanted. And the best thing is we create these like engineering little sort of masterpieces, and the day that we pass it to animation and see them brought to life is incredible. And that's what it's all about. We're entertaining, you know, the audience with what we make every day. And we're also, you know, having a good time while we do it as well.